So you got your first invite to a fantasy basketball league. You understand fantasy football, but you have no idea how fantasy basketball works. You're all like,
do I really need to set my lineups every day? Is it true that I need to focus on my field goal percentage? I think it's going to be a little bit too much for me.
No fear. In this episode, we're going to explain the fantasy basketball basics, and we'll also help you find the format that works best for you. Chances are, if you can hear the sound of my voice, you are likely familiar with fantasy football. You're thinking about jumping into fantasy basketball for the first time, or you just got an invite to a fantasy basketball league and you don't know where to start. So what is fantasy basketball? Fantasy basketball is a fantasy sport for basketball that was popularized during the 1990s after the advent of the internet. Players take the role of general managers of the fantasy teams they create for drafting actual NBA players based primarily on their basketball statistics. Translation, wild nerdy, and we love it. So before you click accept to join that fantasy basketball league, you want to understand what format you're playing. There are a few different options out there, so we're going to go over them all so you can fully understand your options. The first format is Rotisserie or ROTO. It's the most common way to play fantasy sports, and I think it's actually the format that originated it all through baseball. In this scoring type, teams are ranked from first to last in each statistical category. Points are then awarded according to the order in each category, then totaled to determine an overall score and league rank. Next up are the category leagues. There are a couple different types. First up, we're going to go over head-to-head each category. Head-to-head each category is the most common type of head-to-head play in fantasy basketball. It allows you to select the X number of statistic categories. For each scoring period, team totals are accumulated and a win, loss, or tie is credited in each category based on the match-up results. Next up, we have head-to-head most categories. Head-to-head most categories allows you to set the X number of statistic categories. For each scoring period, usually Monday through Sunday, team totals are accumulated in each of the categories. At the end of the scoring period, the winner is determined by which team wins the most number of categories. The end result is a win, a loss, or a tie. These results correspond directly to each team's overall record. Next up, we have points leagues. Head-to-head points is very similar to how fantasy football is played. It allows you to assign a given point value to individual statistic categories, and each scoring period's winner is determined solely by which team accumulates the most fantasy points versus a single opponent. The end result is a win, loss, or a tie. If selected, your team will have team schedules, playoffs, and you will have the option to set up divisions. Next up is season points. Season point scoring allows you to assign a given point value to each individual statistical category. Standings are based on the accumulation of points covering all statistical categories and combined into one total points column. The team with the most overall points wins. Last but not least, game pick format. Game pick is only available on the Sleeper app. Owners choose one game per starter to count against their weekly point total in head-to-head matchups. You pick one game per week for each player based on a player's matchups, home versus away, opponents, defensive ranking, pace of play, and more. Let's quickly talk about settings. Most default settings are at 13 roster spots. If you have a league that's smaller than 12 teams, you might want to consider expanding your rosters a little bit. Also, I wouldn't make my league smaller than 8 teams. Another tip for settings, you want to make sure you have some IR spots, injured reserve spots. In terms of the playoffs for your settings, you don't want to have your season run right until the end of the NBA season. So I would move your schedule up in terms of when your playoffs start to sometime in mid-March. And the reason you want to make sure that your playoffs are happening in mid-March is because some teams rest their players. Also, some of the teams out there are not playing for a playoff spot, and they might actually tank and not play their best player. So you want to avoid all of that. And of course, if you're playing Roto, it would go right to the end of the regular season. Another thing you might want to consider, especially if it's like your second year and you have a little bit of experience under your belt, think about maybe removing the limitation on how many centers you can draft. In terms of free agency, there are really 3 ways you can do it. The first way is having a waiver system. Basically, people who drop a player, that player would be in waivers for a certain amount of time according to your settings, and then people who are in that particular waiver order would have access or get first dibs on that player. The second way is no waivers, where if I drop the player into free agency, you can just jump in and grab the person. That creates a free-for-all, and I wouldn't recommend it. Last but not least, we have FAAB, which is FAAB, known for Free Agent Acquisition Budget. This one is really, really fun, but a little more complicated, and I wouldn't recommend it for newcomers. But once you're in your second or third year, I would give it a shot. You got to try it at least once. Now let's talk a little bit about trades. You have to have a trade deadline. If you don't have a trade deadline, people are going to try to make questionable trades towards the end of the season. So I would recommend having the trade deadline sometime in February, maybe even late January. Before we move on from trades, let's talk about the hot topic, vetoes. You should never have a league vote for vetoes. It shouldn't be like, Jimmy and Bobby made a trade. Sally and Tom don't like it, so we're going to rally together to vote to veto the trade. It's ridiculous and just adds a whole level of drama to your league. What I would recommend is that league managers are the only people that can veto. And the only reason for a veto, if it's clear collusion. Like if someone is like, hey, give me your Jordan Clarkson, I'll give you Giannis and Kat. That's not a trade that should go through. Also, if you have people like that in your league who are making trades, I would boot them from the league. We don't like that in the fantasy basketball community. Before we go any further, I want to get your take on what league format you think will work best for you. Is it Roto, category, points league, game pick, best ball? Let me know in the comments. Now let's talk about drafts, arguably the best part of fantasy sports. You have to go through your data, you have to get your rankings. It's just a really fun experience. Now, there are a couple ways to do drafts. The most common draft type is a snake draft. Basically, you pick who's going to go in what order. Sometimes people randomize it. Sometimes people do games to figure out who goes first and who goes last. After everyone picks, then the order reverses. So, for example, you pick 1 through 12, and then at the end of that round, the person who went 12th would then go first, and then so on. It's a really cool way to draft. Next up, we got auctions or salary cap drafts. In an auction draft, every team manager gets the same amount of money for their budget. Then they go into an auction and they bid on players. There are a lot of different techniques and strategies to use for auction drafts. If you want a video about that, please let me know in the comments. And the last draft type is an auto draft, which I don't recommend, which is not very popular and kind of lame. Basically, the computer picks who's on what team. It just makes no sense and it's a waste of time, in my opinion. If you like auto drafts, let me know in the comments. Those are the formats. There are a couple of ways that you can do drafts. You can do them live in person, which is very fun, or you can do them online. Online drafts are very popular. However, if you've been doing your league for a couple of years, I would strongly recommend getting the gang together and doing a live draft. Now, I told you the last part of this video was going to be the most important piece of the puzzle. The last thing I want to talk about is the platforms that you choose. There are a number of options that you have. One of the most popular platforms is Yahoo. Yahoo has really up-to-date data. They keep up with roster changes. It's a great platform. Next up is ESPN, which is one of my favorite platforms. They do struggle sometimes with keeping their rosters up to date, but overall, I really, really love the platform. Then we have Fantrax. Fantrax is really for those fantasy heads. If you are a fantasy football player, you'd really, really love to test out Fantrax for fantasy basketball. Next up, we have CBS. I'm not so familiar with CBS, but I hear it's an okay platform. We talked about Sleeper early. That's the only platform that you can play the game pick format. So my recommendation, if you are a beginner, like this is your first time learning about fantasy basketball, you just got invited, you played some fantasy football, I would strongly recommend starting out with the Sleeper app and game pick. All you have to do is pick one game per week. It's very similar to fantasy football, and it'll give you the opportunity to kind of understand the stats, the categories, things of that nature. From there, then I would recommend getting into a points league. For me personally, points leagues are my favorite platform just because of my bandwidth in my life. However, if you feel like you're not getting a challenge from points leagues, I would then move on to category leagues. If you want me to unpack any of these topics that I covered in this episode, please let me know in the comments and I'd love to make a video for it. Also, please join our brand new Discord server if you need help with game picks, team names, trades, waiver pickups, the works. All you have to do is hit the link in the description of this episode. Also, don't forget to bang on that subscribe button, hit us with a thumbs up, and leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. And don't forget, play the waivers, set your lineups, and check out the next episode, you freaking fantasy nerds.